When discussing things like tradition or traditionalism, people tend to confuse it oftentimes with a more conservative or reactionary outlook, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. In fact, I would make a distinction between traditionalism and conservatism, or having a more reactionary attitude. This also includes discussions in many cases of new developments or new changes which may occur. In terms of changes or developments in and of themselves, they are not necessarily antithetical to the principles of any given tradition, and so the traditionalist response, as I would define it, would be more so to look at the principles of the tradition and to use those principles to understand whether a change or a development is good or bad. And there is a basic point to be derived from this, which is that changes or developments in and of themselves aren't bad or good. There are many different considerations which should be made before understanding the nature of a change or a development and whether ultimately it will be a good thing or a bad thing. This actually comes back to a fundamental point about the kind of dialectic that is often created around developments, aka the usual dialectic that is given of progressivism and reactionary attitude, of a more reactionary or conservative approach. But in reality, the terms themselves, reactionary or conservative and progressive, they are very much relative terms, and they are very subjective from time to place and from one society to another. By one standard, a certain thing may be conservative, it may preserve the status quo of a society, but on the other hand, it might actually be a progressive thing in another society. So that kind of dialectic that is often created or manufactured in terms of progressivism or reactionary attitude, it often breaks down under further scrutiny when you realize that those two terms are very much subjective and relative, and once again the nature of changes and developments aren't that they are always inherently good or inherently bad, and should always be marked either with inherent skepticism and rejection or inherent acceptance. In reality, we should take these changes, like I said, on their face and try to evaluate them for their merits and their weaknesses, and we should try and evaluate the nature of change based on the thing itself rather than simply being reactionary against it or progressive running with it. I mean, there are a few examples of this. For example, what essentially is considered Western conservatism, or what in many mainstream strands of right-wing thought within the West is considered to be conservative or upholding what they would consider to be the Western tradition, really in many cases is quite liberal or libertarian in its nature. For example, they will defend things like capitalism, they will defend things like classical liberalism, and you can see that it is way more progressive compared to the conservatism of the rest of the world. In particular, if you look at things like Islamic conservatism perhaps, or the conservatism of maybe the Russians or the Slavs or the Eastern European peoples. But when you look at the West, its conservatism is very much of a liberal nature fundamentally. And of course, this isn't all Western conservatism. There is a lot of Western conservatism which might tap into the more traditionalist route, or it might tap into the more ultra-reactionary kind of route. But many of the mainstream strands of Western conservatism tend to be this kind of liberal thing. It tends to be quite liberal or libertarian by its nature. However, on a historical level, we can see that many of the great intellectual revolutions, which we may consider to be quite conservative nowadays, in their time were quite revolutionary in their nature, and they were certainly quote-unquote progressing society in a certain direction away from the status quo. For example, many of the great religious projects, particularly of the Axial Age, for example, the Islamic, Christian projects, so the broader Semitic religious projects, or the other projects, the other religious projects of this time, can be considered as these kinds of conservative revolutionary forces, in that they challenged many of the assumptions and even the political models of the status quo of the time and attempted to reshape the world in their own image. Of course, for us, these things may now be very conservative, but when they first came into being, perhaps, they were very much these revolutionary forces capable of challenging the status quo of their times. And also another reason why this thing, like let's say this concept of this kind of dialectic that is created of being reactionary or of being progressive doesn't really make sense, is that in what sense, in what time frame are we specifically referring to? Because like I mentioned, coming back to the previous point, what may be reactionary in one time period will actually be progressive perhaps in another time period. And what may be considered conservative by one group of peoples may not be considered conservative by another group of peoples. For example, take this video of mine from a friend of mine who, has made some interesting videos in this regard, and take a look at it.
The whole world tells us to chase its own interpretation of success. Get the degree, travel the world, become independent, and basically build your dream life. But what if we've been climbing the ladder only to realize it's leaning against the wrong wall? Guess what? One of the longest running studies in history, the Harvard study of adult development, did not find out that wealth or social status creates the happiest people. It actually found out that the quality of our close relationships is one of the strongest predictors of a healthy and fulfilling life. Yet today, we're slowly treating relationships as disposable. Of course, social media tells us that cut them off, protect your peace, and you don't owe anyone anything. Sometimes that is actually the right advice, especially when there's situations where you're encountering abuse or if anything else is dangerous. But it doesn't necessarily apply to all other situations as well. And that real psychology is not built on 30-second slogans necessarily. Across multiple different religious and spiritual traditions, one idea appears again and again: healthy families create healthy societies.
Now, I'll leave my friend's socials in the description below if you want to go check his content out more. However, you can actually understand from this that things like the family, things like these spiritual values, these are typically understood to be conservative in their nature. However, I want to, and this comes back to the important point of making this distinction between traditionalism and conservatism. Because yes, it may be considered traditional, but would it necessarily be conservative? Now, I know on face value this does seem conservative, but a few points should be made here. In reality, the breakdown of families, the breakdown of communities, the breakdown of these communal spiritual values is a product of this kind of liberal capitalist system. But not only that, it is a product of modernity. It's a product of the breaking down of these broader organic structures and very much their replacement by the institutions of the state. It is a fundamental characteristic and symptom of modernity and of the issues that have affected many Western nations in the past century or so. However, an important point is to be made here. Many Western conservatives will be against these things, the breakdown of the family, the breakdown of communities. However, like I've mentioned before, many of these Western conservatives in the same vein will also be committed to things like the modern paradigm, modernity. They will be committed to the liberal paradigm on a fundamental level. They will be committed to upholding many of these systems, a lot of the status quo. They will accept things like capitalism, like liberal capitalism, and they are very much committed to upholding the status quo, like I've said. And so the fundamental issue for many of the conservatives in the Western context to face is that liberal capitalism has sown the seeds of destruction for these institutions. Liberal capitalism has led to the breakdown of communities and families, because if we put material interests first and foremost, but on a more fundamental level, if we attempt to maximize individual liberty in and of itself without any consideration for other principles such as the collective principle, well then this is inevitably the end result of that. And then in a similar vein on the other side, I see many of those who subscribe to a more progressive mindset, like many of the leftist movements, in particular the Marxists, will insist that the family institution is a capitalist institution. Now, don't get me wrong, the institution of the family, many of the typical roles and stereotypes, many of the typical gender roles associated with the family, have been maintained and established by the status quo of various societies. That is an obvious fact, and that is self-evidently true. However, what I think the Marxists sometimes tend to overlook is that the family as an institution is under threat by capitalism. It is under threat by liberal capitalism, because liberal capitalism sows the seeds of its destruction. Yes, capitalist societies may have an interest in reproducing its own version, let's say, or its own rendered edition of the family as an institution within its societies. However, what this also ignores is that capitalism very much sows the seeds of destruction for the family institution, for communities. And so inevitably what happens is liberal capitalism, in pursuit of profit, stops at nothing to dissolve these organic units of relationships, of human connection. And again, this is very much one of the contradictions of capitalism, and particularly the model of liberal capitalism in the West, that it inevitably sows the seeds of destruction for the family and for the institutions which it would have once initially have sought to replicate and reproduce. In reality, it sows the seeds for its destruction and for its ultimate demise. And in a similar vein, many of those on the left who identify with this more progressive strand would intuitively be against the atomization of society and mass loneliness. However, what they don't seem to understand is that it is precisely the nature of capitalism which has broken down these organic forms of organization in society, of the family, of communities, which has led to this atomization. And hence, I think for both conservatives and for progressives, if they wanted to oppose atomization in society, which I think is a shared goal between them both, they have to address the breakdown in families, they have to address the breakdown in communities, the breakdown in spiritual values, and they have to address the destructive nature of liberal capitalism as well in this regard. This isn't to just attack on or completely blame liberal capitalism in the sense that, there are good things which arise out of capitalism, and there are good things which we can benefit from liberalism as well. However, this is one of the most fundamental flaws of the liberal capitalist model, and one of the most fundamental problems and issues which has been created, especially in Western societies, by the liberal capitalist model, in that it breaks down these organic units of organization within society. It breaks down these organic units of connection, of relationships, and it leaves man as this atomized, hyper-individualistic consumer unit in many cases. And this is where traditionalism comes in. Traditionalism, far from merely being reactionary against something or progressive with it, would analyze a thing, analyze a change or development based on principles, based on fundamental aspects of reality which they understand. And they would evaluate these changes and developments then on their own merits, whether they're good or bad. For example, freedom of markets, freedom of trade, and restricting government interference in the private lives of its citizens is an important principle for any society to uphold. Otherwise, if this autonomy, freedom, and independence is stripped away from its citizens, it will necessarily lead to a tyrannical society. However, at the same time, we have to maintain the organic institutions of unity, of community, of family that bind the society together and will allow for its survival and reproduction, and will most of all maintain on a very basic and profound level the sense of human connection and the sense of human bonding and belonging that is necessary for any society to function. Based on these principles, we can maintain individualism and individual liberty in its utmost degree, whilst also getting rid of the excesses and the extremities of liberalism, of the way that individual liberty may be incorrectly operationalized within the liberal paradigm, and also of the excesses of the capitalist model, which isn't just about free markets, but very much ends up leading to this maximizing profit at all cost attitude, which ignores the damage to communities, to families, to the planet, etc., etc. And hence we could maintain a system where there are free markets, where there are free trade, where the governments aren't overly interfering, where basic individualism and individual liberty is maintained, without falling into the excesses and extremities of liberalism and of liberal capitalism. Thus, it avoids being simply reactionary against a thing, like completely rejecting everything that capitalism may advocate for, but neither will it completely accept it on the basis of some supposed progress. And so we can critically engage with capitalism, we can accept some of its good qualities, we can reject its bad qualities, and develop our own models based upon that then. And the same thing can be said for things like communism and socialism. Again, communism or socialism, there are aspects of it which may actually be beneficial or necessary. You know, things like welfare programs, things like state spending, which may in certain cases be necessary. However, the government cannot be completely or absolutely involved in the market, as, you know, the great Islamic scholar Ibn Khaldun in the past has mentioned, that it will lead to the depriving of the people's livelihoods if the government owns too many assets within the market and it is overly involved in it. And it will prevent that freedom of trade and freedom of ability to trade and work perhaps within the society, which will lead to that kind of economic stagnation. And so what you need then is to take the good aspects of a more collectivist system, and we can reject some of its worst aspects and then refine it again. And thus we can take the good aspects of these different systems and apply them and see what works, and we can reject the aspects which maybe aren't so good. In truth and in reality, any tradition undergoes multiple developments. This is the historical reality of every single tradition or project, whether it be the religious, the intellectual, the spiritual, the philosophical, the political. All of these traditions undergo developments. They develop within the context of their times, and they respond to various external and internal stimuli. And they constantly develop in relation to one another and within themselves. And they are constantly developing on these different fronts, whether it be intellectual, political, spiritual, etc., etc. And so we have to account for these natural developments. And so we can allow for these developments to occur. These changes can be good, although not necessarily. And so we have to use these fundamental principles. We have to, apply these ideas within a broader framework then, and try to understand whether a change is good or not, and then refine it either or reject it on that basis. But we shouldn't merely be reactionary against it, nor be progressive with it. Again, it is like I have said, understanding the idea for its own merits, evaluating its pros and cons, and then either attempting to perhaps synthesize it with another idea, or refining it, or perhaps accepting it if it's a good idea, or not accepting it if it's a bad idea. We can absolutely do that, but we need not be reactionary against it, nor we have to be progressive with it. And that is the fundamental difference between traditionalism, as I would define it, and conservatism. Whereas within the context of a tradition, we can accept these developments, we can accept these natural changes and intellectual developments that occur within it. Conservatism isn't necessarily the embodiment of traditionalism, because conservatism ignores the natural developments that occur within any given tradition. And in reality, traditions have a long history of constantly developing and constantly changing. And hence it doesn't really make sense to simply accept the status quo as it is and merely retain and regurgitate its ideas, because this ignores the fundamental nature of what tradition is. It is the collective wisdom of great men and women compounded over time, and it doesn't cease to change, it doesn't cease to develop. It's constantly in a state of flux and dynamism. And yes, traditions can stagnate, they can grow decadent, they can become, institutionalized and fossilized. However, institutions by their nature are dynamic. They are developments, as are all intellectual ideas or all collections of intellectual ideas. And hence it would be foolish to simply regurgitate, like I said, what any status quo may claim. And then, like I have mentioned, the conservatives will run into this fundamental issue that because they misunderstand the fundamental nature of tradition, they project that onto the tradition itself and view it as this kind of fossilized, unchanging thing. However, this is simply wrong on a historical basis, because we can trace these developments, we can trace the changes that have occurred within it from each time and each place up until now. And we can trace how those developments can identify the dialogues, the mechanisms, the processes by which those changes occurred. At the same time, those who reject tradition may simply view it as a static thing. In reality, the conservatives and those who reject tradition, in fact, have a very similar or very much the same view of tradition, which is that it is static and unchanging. But in reality, like I have mentioned, on a historical level and tracing the intellectual lineage of any given tradition is constantly changing and developing. It adapts from one intellectual development to another, and there are various developments which occur within it, influenced by external or internal forces. And hence, the conservatives will fundamentally misunderstand that nature of tradition, and so will those who reject it or claim to be progressive, breaking away from it. In reality, tradition can facilitate those developments by its very nature. However, it does not uncritically accept them, but rather evaluates them on the basis of their own merits.